The motorcycles came first as a sound, not the sight of them, not the smell of exhaust and hot rubber that would follow. Just the sound, low and distant and growing, the kind of sound that starts at the base of your spine before it reaches your ears, that your body recognizes as significant, before your mind has time to form an opinion about it. Nora Calloway heard it from behind the glass counter of Henderson's Pawn on Elm Street, and she did not know yet what it meant. She only knew that the glass in the front window had begun to hum a fine vibration that she felt in her back teeth, and that the condensation ring her soda can had left on the countertop was rippling in small concentric circles, the way water ripples when something large moves nearby. She was 20 years old. She had been working at Henderson's Pawn for 14 months. She had spent most of those 14 months learning not to think too hard about the things people brought through the door, because thinking too hard about them was the fastest way to make a job that paid the bills into something that cost you sleep. You took the item, you assessed the item, you offered a price, you documented the transaction. The item went into the case or onto the shelf, and eventually it went home with someone else. And that was the end of it. She had become, through this daily practice of deliberate non-attachment, quite good at her job. Her hand was resting on the counter next to the soda can, and now her hand was resting on the silent alarm button beneath the counter. And she was watching through the front glass as the street outside filled with chrome and leather, and the kind of collective human mass that changes the character of a space simply by being present in it. She had not moved toward the button consciously. Her hand had simply found it the way a hand finds a railing in the dark. 200 motorcycles. She would count them later, or try to. The number would not resolve cleanly because they kept moving, shifting, filling the curb and the parking spaces in the mouth of the alley beside the building, until the street in front of Henderson's Pawn looked like a river that had chosen this particular block to stop. The engines died in a rolling sequence, one after another, the sound tapering from a roar to a rumble to a deep mechanical silence that was somehow louder than the noise had been. Nora stood very still. In the plastic chair in the corner of the shop, the old man who had been sitting there for the past 20 minutes raised his head and looked at the window. His eyes pale as winter sky moved over the scene outside, with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not fear. It was something older than fear. Something that had been on the other side of fear so many times it had stopped registering as a distinct condition. This is where the story begins. Not with the motorcycles, and not with Nora, and not with the alarm button beneath her hand. It begins 45 minutes earlier with a bell above a door, and the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon that has decided to be something other than ordinary. Henderson's Pawn on Elm Street smelled of dust and old paper, and the faint metallic undertone of other people's decisions. The fluorescent light above the middle display case had been flickering since September, which Mr. Ketridge had been meaning to fix and had not fixed. The carpet near the door had a worn path in it that corresponded exactly to the most direct route between the entrance and the counter. A path worn by years of people coming in carrying things they had decided to part with. Nora knew this path the way she knew everything in the shop. By repetition. By presence. She was not a romantic. She had grown up in a practical household with practical parents who believed that clarity about how the world worked was a form of kindness. And she had taken this lesson and applied it thoroughly. She did not lie to herself about what the job was. She did not pretend that the guitars on the wall had not once meant something to the people who brought them in, or that the wedding rings in the case did not carry a history that made them heavy despite their small weight. She knew all of that. She simply did not dwell on it because dwelling on it did not change any of it. And she had a rent payment due on the 1st. The bell above the door chimed on a Tuesday in November, and Nora looked up from the condensation ring she had been tracing on the glass countertop, and she saw the old man. He was standing just inside the doorway, and he had stopped there, not because he was confused or hesitant, but because he was taking a moment. The way certain people take a moment before doing something they have decided to do and cannot allow themselves to undo. His back was straight, which was the first thing she noticed. A deliberate straightness, the kind that has been maintained over decades as a point of personal principle and that costs something to maintain at 99 years old, but is maintained regardless. He was thin in the way of people who have been thin for a long time. His frame inside a tweed coat that had been well made once and had endured. The coat hung from his shoulders with a kind of dignity. The dignity of a thing that was never flashy and has not needed to become flashy because it has always simply been what it was. His hands. She noticed his hands second. They were the hands of someone who had lived extensively in the physical world. Large-knuckled, deliberate, the skin thin and translucent with age. And they were trembling. Not a dramatic tremor. The fine, high-frequency kind, the kind that is not about emotion, but about the simple fact of time and what time does to the mechanisms of the body. In those hands he held a small box covered in dark velvet. He held it the way you hold something that you have picked up and set down many times before, finally deciding to carry it out the door. The velvet was worn smooth at the corners, the nap pressed flat by years of handling. He came to the counter. He set the box down. He did not push it toward her. He simply set it down and rested his trembling fingers on the lid. And he looked at her with those pale eyes. And he waited. She said, "Can I help you?" He said, "I have these." His voice was dry and precise. The voice of a man who had once used it to give commands in difficult circumstances and had since learned to use it more sparingly. He did not elaborate. The box was the elaboration. She drew it toward her. She lifted the lid. The satin inside was old, faded from whatever color. It had once been to a pale ivory, and in it, arranged with a care that was visible in their exact positioning, lay 3 medals. Nora had been working at Henderson's Pawn for 14 months, and she had seen a fair number of military medals come through the door. She had learned to assess them the way she had learned to assess everything, by category, by material, by collectible value. Bronze content of a Bronze Star, silver content of a Distinguished Service Cross. The auction market for Purple Hearts among collectors, which was a market she found uncomfortable to think about, and therefore did not think about. She lifted the Purple Heart first. It was cool and heavier than it looked, and she turned it over to find the name engraved on the back. Walter Greer. She set it down and looked at the Distinguished Service Cross. She looked at the Bronze Star. She looked at the man across the counter from her who had not moved, who was watching her with the patience of someone who has learned that some things cannot be hurried. "These are real," she said. Her voice had come out quieter than she intended. He gave a small, precise nod. His jaw was set in the way of people who are holding something in place through force of will. She knew what came next. She was supposed to tell him she needed a moment to research current market values. And then she was supposed to open the blue book and find the relevant entries. And then she was supposed to offer him somewhere between a quarter and a third of that value, because that was the margin on which the shop operated. And he would either accept, or he would pick up the box and leave, and either outcome was a transaction. She said, "Can you tell me what you were hoping to get for them?" He looked away, not at anything specific, at the barred window that faced the street. The gray November light came through it at an angle that caught the silver of the Distinguished Service Cross in its case and made it briefly very bright. He said, "Enough." Then he cleared his throat. The small, controlled clearing of a man who will not allow his voice to become unreliable in public. He said, "Enough for the week's groceries." The words fell onto the glass countertop between them. Not rent, not a medical bill which would have been comprehensible and terrible in a way that had a category, not car repairs or a utility shutoff, or any of the other catastrophic expenses that brought people through the door of Henderson's pawn with things they could not afford to hold on to anymore. Groceries. The word sat there, and Nora looked at it, and she understood in the specific and practical way she understood things that she was standing at the edge of something. She said, "I need to verify the provenance on pieces of this significance. It is standard procedure for items with documented military history. I need to take a look at the service records if you have them." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a brief recalibration. And then he reached into the inner pocket of the tweed coat and produced a folded envelope. He set it on the counter beside the box. She took the envelope. She unfolded it. Inside was what she had expected, a summary document from the Department of Veterans Affairs confirming the service record of Walter Greer Army 2nd Infantry Division, European Theater, 1943 to 1945. The medals were listed and authenticated. The document was what it said it was, but there were other papers folded behind it. She almost did not unfold them. It was not her business what other papers a man carried in his coat pocket. She was supposed to be looking at the authentication documents, not at whatever had been tucked behind them. She unfolded them. They were correspondence. 6 pages on the letterhead of a financial services firm, Harlow and Associates Wealth Management. The letters were dated across a span of 14 months, the most recent one 3 weeks ago. She did not read every word. She did not need to. She was 20 years old, and she had grown up in a practical household, and she had been doing this job for 14 months. And she understood what she was looking at, a retirement account that had contained 14 months ago a balance sufficient to sustain a man of 99 years for the remainder of his life, and a series of transactions each documented on Harlow and Associates letterhead, each justified in the language of investment strategy and market volatility and portfolio rebalancing that had systematically reduced that balance to something that could not sustain anyone for any significant period of time. Dennis Harlow had not stolen from Walter Greer in any way that would have been easy to prosecute. He had done it in the way that certain kinds of theft are done through signatures and authorizations, and the particular helplessness that comes from trusting someone with language you do not fully understand to manage something you have spent a lifetime accumulating. 14 months ago, Walter Greer had been a man with enough money to live out his remaining years without selling anything. 3 weeks ago, he had received the final letter from Harlow and Associates, informing him in careful professional language that his account had been fully liquidated. Today, he was standing in a pawn shop with 3 medals and asking for enough money to buy groceries. Nora set the papers down on the counter. She smoothed them flat with one hand. She did not look at Walter. She looked at the papers. Then she looked at the security camera in the upper corner of the shop. The small black dome that recorded everything that happened at the counter. Mr. Ketridge reviewed the footage periodically, not because he did not trust Nora, but because that was how he ran his business, with documentation and review and the general assumption that trust should be verified. She thought about Mr. Ketridge. He would be back from lunch in approximately 20 minutes. She knew his schedule the way she knew all the routines of the shop. She thought about the transaction she was supposed to complete. She could offer Walter Greer somewhere between $800 and $1,200 for 3 medals of this provenance, which was a fair pawn shop offer, and which would buy him more than a week's groceries, and which would put the medals in the display case behind her, priced at 3 to 4 times what she had paid, where they would sit until a collector came through, who was interested in that period and that theater. She thought about Walter Greer sitting in the plastic chair in the corner of the shop, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned to wait in conditions she would never understand. She thought about the word groceries. She said, "Will you give me a few minutes? I need to verify one more thing with our record specialist. It is policy for pieces of this level of historical significance." It was a lie. Henderson's Pawn did not have a record specialist. Mr. Ketridge's specialist was a price guide published 12 years ago. Walter Greer looked at her. He nodded once. He shuffled to the plastic chair in the corner and lowered himself into it, with the controlled care of someone who understands that the body has to be managed now, and manages it without complaint. He looked small in the chair, surrounded by the clutter of the shop, the unclaimed guitars, and the outdated electronics and the things that had been other people's before they became inventory. Nora picked up the velvet box and walked into the back office. She closed the door. She stood in the small, cluttered space with the box in her hands, and her heart doing something that it did not usually do on Tuesday afternoons, which was beat fast enough to be noticeable. She set the box on the desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took out her phone. She was not going to call a specialist. She had known before she closed the door that she was not going to call a specialist. She had closed the door because she needed to do something, and she could not do it standing at the counter under the security camera's black dome. And the thing she needed to do had not fully formed itself in her mind yet. But her hands were already moving, her phone already in her hand, because sometimes the body knows what the mind has not finished deciding. She took a photograph of the 3 medals. The desk lamp caught the silver cross and the edges of the purple ribbon and made them clear and specific and unmistakable. She looked at the photograph on her screen. She thought about what she knew how to do, which was not very much that felt applicable to this situation. She could assess the market value of second-hand goods. She could operate the point-of-sale system and the documentation software. She could open and close the shop, and she could handle difficult customers, and she could do the inventory count on Sundays. She could post things on social media. She had been doing that since she was 12 years old. It was not a skill she had ever thought of as significant. She opened the community page for the local area. 11,000 members, mostly neighborhood announcements and lost pet notices and the occasional argument about traffic patterns. She started typing. She did not plan what she was gonna write. She wrote the way you speak when you do not have time to be careful. When the thing you are trying to say is more urgent than the way you are saying it. She wrote a 99-year-old veteran named Walter Greer is in Henderson's Pond on Elm Street right now. He served at Normandy. He is trying to sell his Distinguished Service Cross, his Purple Heart, and his Bronze Star to buy groceries this week. A financial advisor named Dennis Harlow took everything he had saved. I work here. I am stalling as long as I can. I do not know what else to do. I just know I cannot let this happen. She read it back once. Then she pressed post. She sat in the office and listened to her own breathing. For approximately 30 seconds, nothing happened. The world outside the office door was exactly what it had been. The fluorescent light in the shop was still flickering. Walter Greer was still in the plastic chair. The medals were still in the box on the desk in front of her. Then her phone buzzed once, then twice. Then it buzzed continuously, a sustained vibration that she had to set the phone face down on the desk to stop. Except stopping, it did not stop the notifications. It only stopped her from seeing them in real time. And when she picked it up again 30 seconds later, the number had grown in a way that made her feel briefly dizzy. She did not look at the specific numbers. Numbers were not the point. The point was the words in the comments, which she scrolled through with her thumb shaking slightly, because her hands had decided to be unsteady, now that the decision was already made and could not be unmade. The comments said things like, "This is not okay." The comments said things like, "Someone needs to do something." The comments said things like, "I am sharing this right now." The comments said things like, "Where exactly on Elm Street?" She heard the bell above the front door. For one terrible second, she thought it was Mr. Ketridge, back early from lunch, and she stood up from the desk chair, fast enough to knock it backward, and she picked up the velvet box and opened the office door. It was not Mr. Ketridge. It was a woman who wanted to look at the camera equipment in the front case, and Nora helped her with a steadiness she did not feel, and let her leave without buying anything and stood behind the counter watching the street outside. Walter Greer had not moved from his chair. She went back to the office. She looked at her phone. The post had been shared. She could see it spreading in the way that things spread. When they have found the particular frequency that a community responds to, when the thing being shared corresponds to something that people already feel, but have not been given language for, and the language arrives and the response is immediate and collective. Her phone buzzed continuously now. She turned the sound off. She thought about Dennis Harlow. She thought about the letters on Harlow and Associates letterhead, about the language of portfolio rebalancing and market volatility used to explain why a man who had survived Normandy was standing in a pawn shop at 99 years old, asking for enough money to eat. She thought about what she could actually do about Dennis Harlow, which was not much because she was 20 years old, and she worked in a pawn shop, and she had no legal training and no financial expertise, and no institutional authority of any kind. She thought about the photograph on her phone, the silver cross, the purple ribbon, the name on the back of the medal, Walter Greer. She went back out to the counter. Walter was still in the chair. He was looking at the floor. She could not tell if he was thinking or resting or doing both simultaneously, which was probably a skill you developed over 99 years of having a body that needed rest and a mind that did not always cooperate. She said, "Mr. Greer, I am still working on the verification. Thank you for your patience." He looked up. He nodded once. He looked back at the floor. She stood behind the counter and she watched the street outside, and she waited, which was what she had told him she needed him to do, and which was what she was doing herself, though, for different reasons and toward a different end that she could not yet see clearly. 16 minutes passed. She knew it was 16 because she watched the clock on the wall above the door. The same clock she always watched because time management was important in this job, and because the clock was directly in her line of sight. 16 minutes in which her phone buzzed silently in the office and the street outside was ordinary, and the flickering light above the middle case flickered, and Walter Greer sat in the corner chair, and Nora Calloway stood behind the counter and tried to look like someone doing routine work. Then she heard it. Not yet the motorcycles. Not the chrome and the leather and the rolling thunder that would come. First, she heard something that she would later struggle to describe precisely, because it was not quite a sound and not quite a feeling, but something that existed in the space between those two things. A change in the quality of the air outside the building. A pressure differential that registered in some part of the brain that predates language. The glass in the front window began to hum. Her soda can, still on the counter where she had left it, trembled slightly. Walter looked up from the floor. His pale eyes went to the window. He was reading the situation with the unhurried competence of someone who has spent significant portions of his life needing to correctly identify what a sound meant before it arrived. The bell above the door chimed. It was not the approaching motorcycles. It was Mr. Ketridge. He was earlier than she had expected, which was the thing she had been afraid of, and which was now happening. He came in the way he always came in, brisk and certain, a man who owned the space and moved through it like an owner. He had a paper coffee cup in one hand and a phone in the other, and he was looking at the phone as he came through the door. And then he stopped. He was looking at his phone because someone had shared Nora's post to a community group that Mr. Ketridge himself was a member of, and the share had landed in his feed while he was walking back from the sandwich place on the corner. And he had read it on the way, and he had understood what he was reading before he finished the first sentence. He looked up from the phone. He looked at Nora behind the counter. He looked at the old man in the plastic chair. He looked at the empty spot on the counter where the velvet box had been sitting before Nora took it to the office. His face did what faces do when the thing they are processing is complicated enough to require a moment before any expression is ready. He said, "Nora. Office. Now." She went. She carried herself across the shop floor with the same steadiness she had maintained all afternoon. And she went into the office, and Mr. Ketridge followed and closed the door behind him. He said, "You posted this from our address while you were working about a customer." She said yes. He held up his phone so she could see the screen. She could see that the post had spread further than she had known. The number of shares was high enough to be genuinely surprising. She kept her face neutral. He said, "Take it down. Right now. This is a legal issue. Customer privacy. Our reputation." She looked at her own phone. She opened the post. The comments were still coming in. She could see in the first several visible comments that people were asking for the address, that people were saying they were coming, that the post had reached beyond the local community page, that it had found networks she had not intended to reach. She looked up at Mr. Ketridge. She said, "I do not think I can take it down." He said, "I am not asking if you can. I am telling you to." She said, "Even if I deleted the original post right now, it has already been shared enough times that deleting it would not stop what is already happening. It would only look like we were trying to hide something, which would probably make it worse." He stared at her. She held the phone out so he could see the screen, the comments, the shares, the way the thing had moved beyond the small, contained world of a local community page into something else, something that had its own momentum now. Mr. Ketridge looked at the screen. She watched him calculate. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful man, which was different. He had built his business on careful calculation and the management of exposure. And what he was looking at right now on her screen was a situation that had moved beyond the point where careful calculation could contain it. He opened his mouth, and that was when the sound arrived, not the distant precursor she had felt in her back teeth a moment ago. The thing itself, the actual motorcycles close enough, now that the sound was not a sound anymore, but a physical presence, a vibration that moved through the floor and up through the soles of her shoes and through her legs and into her chest, where it sat alongside her heartbeat and made itself at home. The fluorescent light above the middle case flickered twice and went out completely. In the corner of the shop through the closed office door, Nora heard Walter Greer get to his feet. She heard the particular sound of an old man standing up with intention. The small, controlled sounds of weight distribution and joint management. That were the sounds of a body that had been doing hard things for 99 years and had not stopped. She looked at Mr. Ketridge. He was looking at the front window of the shop visible through the small rectangle of glass set into the office door. The light outside the window had changed. It had darkened in a way that did not correspond to cloud cover or the advancing afternoon. It had darkened because the street outside was full curb to curb and beyond with motorcycles and the people on them. She had posted a message to 11,000 people. She had not known who would read it or what they would do with it. She had only known that she could not stand behind the counter and complete a transaction that felt like a desecration and then go home and sleep. She still did not know what was going to happen. She looked at the office door. Through the glass rectangle, she could see the front window of the shop. And through the front window, she could see the street. And in the street, she could see the motorcycles and the people on them, and the way they filled the available space with a collective mass that turned the ordinary Tuesday afternoon into something that would not fit into any category she had prepared for. 200 motorcycles. Chrome and leather and the particular dignity of machines built for distance, built for the open road, built to carry people who had decided that the road was the right place to be. They sat at idle, a controlled, deliberate rumble, and the sound of them together was the sound of something that has made up its mind. A man at the front of the line swung his leg over his bike. He was large in the specific way of men who have been strong their whole lives and have not stopped being strong, with a gray beard, and the posture of someone who has stood in difficult places and has not flinched. His leather vest was covered in patches, and the one across his back was unmistakable even through the glass and the November light. He walked toward the door. The two men behind him fell into position at his flanks, flanking him the way men fall into position when they have spent enough time in proximity to understand each other's movements without needing to discuss them. Nora looked at Mr. Ketridge. Mr. Ketridge was looking at his phone. His phone was showing him the same screen her phone was showing the post. The comments, the shares, the number of people who had looked at a photograph of 3 medals on a pawn shop desk and had decided that they needed to do something about it. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said nothing. The bell above the door chimed. The man with the gray beard and the patches stepped into Henderson's Pawn on Elm Street, and the shop contracted around him the way small spaces contract around people who occupy more than their physical dimensions. And behind him, the two men stationed themselves at either side of the door like something architectural. And the shop was very quiet except for the low idling of 200 engines outside. And from the corner chair, Walter Greer looked at the man who had just walked in. And he did what he had done all afternoon. He waited, lightly, without urgency. He was 99 years old, and he had learned that patience was not passive, that it was a form of readiness, and he was ready for whatever this was, because he had been ready for difficult things since 1943, and he had not stopped. Nora stepped out of the office and came to stand behind the counter. The man with the gray beard looked at the shop. His eyes moved over the merchandise, over the cases, over the walls. They moved with the particular efficiency of eyes that have been trained to assess environments quickly and accurately. They did not stop on the cash register. They did not stop on any of the merchandise. They stopped on the velvet box that Nora had brought back from the office and set on the counter when she came out. He came to the counter. Up close, he was larger than the window had suggested. He smelled of cold air and leather, and something faint and clean underneath. His eyes were direct and clear, and they looked at her with an intelligence that she had not expected, though she could not have said what she had expected, because she had not allowed herself to form an expectation. He said, his voice a low, deliberate sound, "We are here because of what you did." He set his phone on the counter. The screen showed her post. The number of shares was higher than the last time she had looked. He looked at the velvet box for a moment. Then he looked at the corner of the shop. Walter Greer was watching him. The man with the gray beard walked toward the old man in the plastic chair, and he walked the way you walk when you are approaching something that requires care, not slowly but deliberately with an awareness of the other person's space. He stopped a respectful distance from the chair. He said, "Ray Decker, USMC 88 to 92. Gulf War." He extended his hand. It was a large hand, calloused and certain. Walter Greer looked at the hand. He looked up at the man's face. Then he put his palm to the chair arm, and he pushed himself upright and he straightened to his full height, which was not impressive by any objective measure, but which carried in it something that had nothing to do with physical dimension. And he reached out his own trembling hand, and he shook. Walter Greer, Army, 2nd Infantry Division, 43 to 45. Normandy. The word sat in the air of the pawn shop. Normandy. Outside, the 200 engines idled on. The afternoon light through the barred window fell across the old man's face and the gray-bearded man's face and the handshake between them. And Nora Calloway stood behind the counter of Henderson's pawn. And she did not move because there are moments when the correct thing to do is to stand very still and let the moment be exactly what it is without interference. From the office doorway, Mr. Ketridge watched. He was still holding his paper coffee cup. He had not taken a sip of it since he came back from lunch. It had gone cold while he read the post on his phone, and while he came through the door, and while he told Nora to take it down. And it was cold now. And he held it. And he watched the handshake between two men who had been in two different wars 50 years apart. And his face did the thing that faces do when they are required to reconsider something they thought they had already settled. The street outside had not moved. The engines had not stopped. The bell above the door did not chime again, because no one left. Because everyone who was in the building understood in the various ways that people understand things without needing to articulate them, that whatever was about to happen had not happened yet. Nora looked at the velvet box on the counter. She looked at Walter Greer standing in the corner of the shop, holding the hand of a man he had never met in a pawn shop on Elm Street on a Tuesday in November, with 200 motorcycles outside, and the afternoon going wherever it was going. She had pressed post before she could think about it too carefully. She did not know yet if that had been the right thing. She suspected she would not know for a long time. What she knew right now was that the 3 medals in the velvet box on the counter were not going to be sold today. She knew this the way she knew certain other things, not through analysis, but through the specific clarity that sometimes arrives when you have done something you cannot undo. And the world has responded, and the response is larger than you planned for, but not larger than the thing that made you act in the first place. The handshake lasted a long time. Outside, the engines idled. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually do, not because either man was making a point of it, not because they were performing something for the room. It lasted because when two people find each other, across the particular distance that separates those who have been in a war from those who have not, the finding takes a moment to be real. The hands were still. The room was still. Outside, 200 engines held their collective breath at idle. Then Ray Decker released the old man's hand carefully, the way you release something you do not want to startle. He turned and looked at Nora behind the counter. His eyes moved from her face to the velvet box and back. He said, "Those medals are not for sale today." It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was the statement of a fact that had not yet been officially established, but that everyone in the room understood to be true, the way certain things become true before anyone has ratified them. Nora said no, they are not. From the office doorway, Mr. Ketridge made a sound that was not quite a word. Nora did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Ray Decker, who was now looking around the shop with the calm assessment of a man taking inventory of a situation. One of the 2 large men stationed at the door leaned out briefly and said something to someone on the street. The engine noise outside shifted slightly. A collective adjustment, the sound of 200 machines being told to settle in. Nora's phone was in her pocket. She could feel it vibrating at intervals regular as a second-hand notifications arriving in a stream that had not slowed since she pressed post 40 minutes ago. She did not take it out. Whatever was happening on the screen of her phone was less important than what was happening in the room. Mr. Ketridge stepped out of the office doorway. He walked to the counter and stood beside Nora, which was either solidarity or the need to be behind something solid, and she did not ask which. He had his own phone in his hand. He looked at the screen and then at Ray Decker, and then at Walter Greer, who had lowered himself back into the plastic chair in the corner. Walter sat with his hands folded in his lap and his back straight, and his pale eyes resting on the middle distance in the particular way of someone who is doing a great deal of internal processing and has learned over a very long life to do it quietly. Mr. Ketridge said, "I have called the police." He said it to the room in general with the tone of a man announcing a decision he has made and is committed to, though the tone underneath the commitment was the tone of a man who is not entirely certain the decision was correct and is hoping the announcement will resolve that uncertainty. Ray Decker looked at him. The look was not hostile. It was patient in the way that very certain people are patient with people who are less certain. He said, "That is fine. We are not doing anything that requires a police response." Mr. Ketridge looked at the two men at the door. He looked at the street outside, which was entirely occupied by leather and chrome, and the kind of presence that does not fit the category of ordinary Tuesday afternoon traffic. He said, 200 motorcycles blocking my street does not require a response. Ray Decker said they are parked. Nobody is blocking anything that needs to move right now. This was technically accurate. The street in front of Henderson's Pawn was not a through street in the sense that it carried significant traffic. It was the kind of street that existed in the particular geography of mid-sized American cities, the kind that serves the immediate businesses on it, and not much else. And on a Tuesday afternoon in November, there was not much else that needed to move through it. Mr. Ketridge looked at Nora. She could see that he was revising his assessment of the situation in real time, updating the calculation that he had begun when he walked through the door early from lunch, incorporating new variables in the way that practical men incorporate variables when ignoring them is no longer possible. He put his phone in his pocket. Outside, a car came down Elm Street from the north end and encountered the motorcycles and stopped. Nora could see it through the front window. The driver looked at the situation and after a moment simply reversed back the way he had come. Nobody who needed to move through was unable to move through. They simply chose not to. 3 minutes passed. The police cruiser arrived from the south end of the block, which was the unoccupied end, and parked there, and 2 officers got out. They stood beside their vehicle for a moment, looking at the motorcycles, doing the same kind of assessment that everyone else had been doing, which was reading the situation before deciding what kind of situation it was. One of them was older. Nora could see that from inside the shop. He was in his 40s, built the way certain men in their 40s are built, with the evidence of physical work in the way he carried himself. He walked ahead of his partner toward the shop, moving through the narrow channel between the motorcycles and the building with the same deliberate calm that Ray Decker had used when he walked through the shop. The bell chimed. He came in. He stopped inside the door. He looked at Ray Decker. Ray Decker looked at him. Something passed between them that Nora could not entirely read, a recognition of some kind, not personal familiarity, but the recognition of one category of person for another. The officer looked at Walter Greer in the plastic chair. He looked at the velvet box on the counter. He looked at the medals because the lid was still open, and the medals were visible: the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross, and the bronze star in their faded satin. He reached up and removed his hat. He held it at his side. He did not put it back on. He stood inside the door of the pawn shop with his hat in his hand, and he looked at Walter Greer, and Walter Greer, who had been looking at the floor, raised his eyes and looked back. The officer said, "Sir," just the one word, but the word carried in it something that words carry sometimes when they are the compression of a great deal more than their single syllable. Walter Greer nodded once. Mr. Ketridge was watching this. Nora watched Mr. Ketridge watch it. His paper coffee cup was still in his left hand cold now, and he was holding it without seeming to know he was holding it, the cup having become irrelevant to the current situation, but not yet released. The officer turned to Mr. Ketridge. He said, "Is there a disturbance here, sir?" Mr. Ketridge looked at the shop, at Ray Decker and his two men, at the counter where the medals lay in the velvet box, at the old man in the corner. He said no disturbance. The officer nodded. He looked at Ray Decker one more time, a look that contained a question, and received an answer that did not require words. Then he went back outside. He stood on the sidewalk with his partner, and they did not leave, but they did not intervene, and after a few minutes the officer with the hat said something to his partner, and his partner went back to the cruiser, and the officer remained on the sidewalk, his hat still in his hand facing the street. Inside Henderson's pawn, Ray Decker turned back to Nora. He said, "You wrote that a man named Dennis Harlow took what belonged to Mr. Greer." She said, "Yes." He said, "You have documentation." She said, "In the office. Letters from his firm, 14 months of them. It is the kind of thing that is done in language that is designed to be confusing. But the result is not confusing. The result is a man with nothing." Ray Decker was quiet for a moment. He looked at one of the men near the door, and something moved between them. A communication of some kind, minimal and complete. The man took out his phone. She did not ask what he was doing with it. She understood that it was relevant, and that she would know what it was relevant to when the time came. She said, "I do not know. What can legally be done about Harlow?" Ray Decker said the law has different shapes. Some of those shapes move faster than others. She looked at him. He said, "We have people who know how to read that kind of documentation. Former investigators. We have people who know how to take what they find to the right places. Not everything has to go through official channels first. Some things go through official channels because unofficial channels made them impossible to ignore." She thought about Dennis Harlow. She thought about him in his office, wherever his office was on this Tuesday afternoon, doing whatever he did on Tuesday afternoons. She thought about him in the language of his letters, the careful, professional language that meant nothing and contained everything. And she thought about what it would mean for that language to stop working as a shield. She said the local paper runs investigations sometimes. Ray Decker said, "I know a few people at the local paper." He said it simply without emphasis, the way you state a fact that is useful rather than remarkable. One of the men near the door had stepped outside. Through the window, Nora could see him moving along the line of motorcycles, talking to people. She could see the people he was talking to, taking out their phones. Within an hour of Nora's post reaching the local paper's night editor, a message would arrive in the editorial inbox from 3 different sources, all pointing to the same documents, all containing the same name. By the following morning, a reporter who had been building a file on Harlow and Associates for 7 months, a file that lacked the specific evidentiary anchor it needed, would have that anchor. The story would run on Thursday. By Friday, the State Financial Regulatory Office would receive more complaints about Dennis Harlow than it had received in the previous 2 years combined. Nora did not know any of this yet. She only knew that the man across the counter from her had said he knew people at the local paper, and that she believed him, and that believing him felt like setting something down that she had not known she was carrying. She said, "What happens now?" Ray Decker said, "Now we take care of what is in front of us." He turned and walked to the corner of the shop where Walter Greer was sitting. He did not pull up a chair. He crouched down, putting himself at eye level with the old man, which was an adjustment that required something from his knees, but which he made without comment, because the point was to be at eye level, and the cost of getting there was not relevant. He said, "Mr. Greer, we would like to do something if you will allow us." Walter Greer looked at him. His pale eyes were clear and direct, and they held in them the quality that Nora had noticed when he first walked through the door, the quality of someone who has been through enough, that the evaluation of new situations happens quickly and accurately. He said, "You do not have to do anything for me." Ray Decker said, "I know we do not have to. That is not why we are here. We are here because we want to, which is a different thing." Walter was quiet for a moment. He said, "I have been managing." Ray Decker said, "I know you have. I can see that. But managing alone is not the same thing as not needing help. And the difference between those two things is something I learned later in life than I should have." The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hands, which were folded in his lap, and trembling at their fine, constant frequency. He said, "All right." Ray Decker stood up. He went to the door and said something to the men stationed there, and one of them went outside, and what happened outside in the next several minutes was something that Nora watched through the front window with the full attention that the situation demanded. A helmet moved through the line of motorcycles, not ceremoniously, not with announcement. It simply moved from the two men at the front who passed it to the people behind them, and those people passed it further. And it went down the line of 200 motorcycles like a current moving through a wire, slow enough to be deliberate and fast enough to be purposeful. Every person it reached put something in it. She could not see the denominations from inside the shop. She could see the gestures, the reach into pockets and vest pockets and jacket linings, the placement of bills into the helmet. And she could see that the people making these gestures were not making a show of them. They were matter-of-fact about it, the way people are matter-of-fact about doing something they have already decided is correct, and that requires no additional deliberation. The helmet came back to the front. The man who carried it inside was the one who had been outside working his phone earlier. He walked to the counter and set the helmet down. It was full. Not overflowing, but full packed with bills that had been placed with the care of people who knew they were putting something into a thing that mattered. Nora looked at the helmet. She did not count what was in it. She would count it later when she helped transfer it to an envelope for Walter. And the number she would arrive at would be a number she had not expected. A number that represented not individual generosity, but collective statement. 200 people saying the same thing simultaneously, in the only language that the situation permitted. Ray Decker brought the helmet to the corner of the shop. He set it on the floor next to Walter's chair He said, "This is for whatever you need. This week and for a while after." Walter Greer looked at the helmet. He looked at the money in it, and then he looked at the window. And his jaw moved in the way that jaws move when the thing a person is holding inside them has become difficult to continue holding. He said, "I did not come here for charity." Ray Decker said, "I know. You came here to make a transaction, to do things the way you have always done them on your own terms without asking. I understand that. I have been that man. But this is not charity. This is a debt that we cannot calculate and cannot repay but can acknowledge. This is the acknowledgment." Walter's hands tightened on each other in his lap. The trembling in them was finer than ever. The fine trembling of something held very still by an effort that was becoming more difficult. He said it was a long time ago. Ray Decker said yes. But what you did does not have a time limit on what it means. None of what any of you did has a time limit. That is the point. The shop was quiet. Mr. Ketridge had not moved from his position beside the counter. His coffee cup was on the counter now, set down at some point without ceremony. He was watching the corner of the shop with an expression that had gone through several revisions since he walked in the door, and had arrived at something that was not easy to name, but that Nora recognized as the expression of a man who has been reminded of something he had not forgotten, but had stopped seeing. The officer outside was still on the sidewalk. Nora could see him through the glass. He had put his hat back on. He was looking at the line of motorcycles, and his posture had the quality of someone who is present not as an authority, but as a witness, which is a different posture, and he knew the difference. Ray Decker pulled a stool from behind the nearby display case, a stool that Mr. Ketridge used when he needed to sit while examining items brought in for appraisal, and he sat on it a reasonable distance from Walter's chair. Not close enough to crowd. Not far enough to signal the conversation was over. He said, "Do you have family nearby, Mr. Greer?" Walter's eyes moved back from the window to the middle distance. He said no. A pause. Then he said, "My wife passed in 1987. We were married 41 years. Ray Decker said, "I am sorry." Walter said she was a good woman. She was a very good woman. The kind you do not describe well because the description never gets close enough to the actual thing. Ray Decker was quiet in the way that invites rather than closes. Walter said, after she was gone, the house got different. I knew how to be in that house with her in it. Without her, it was just rooms. You learn to be in the rooms. But they do not become what they were. He stopped. He looked at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of something being taken out into the open that has been kept indoors for a long time. He said my son Robert and I had not spoken in 30 years when he died. That was in 2003. Heart attack. He was 56 years old. He lived in Tennessee, and I knew that. And I did not drive there. And he did not call here, and we had gotten to the place where not speaking was just what we did. And then he was gone, and not speaking was the only thing left. The shop was very still. He said I was not a good father in the way that matters most. I knew how to provide. I knew how to work, and I knew how to be responsible, and I knew how to give a child everything except the thing he needed from me, which was to know that I saw him, that I was paying attention to him, and not to the ways he failed to be what I expected. I came back from the war. and I had ideas about what a man was supposed to be, and Robert was my son, and I applied those ideas, and I did not understand until it was too late that the ideas were getting in the way of the actual boy. He stopped again. The stopping was not for emotional recovery. It was the stopping of a man who is being very precise and wants to be accurate. He said, "I have not been to his grave. He has been in the ground in Tennessee for 20 years, and I have not been there." I told myself it was because I could not drive that far anymore. That is partially true. But the full truth is that I do not know what I would say when I got there. I've been thinking about it for 20 years, and I still do not know what I would say. Ray Decker did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Sometimes you do not say anything. Sometimes you go and you stand there. And the standing there is what you needed to do, and the words turn out not to have been the point." Walter looked at him. Ray Decker said, "I have a man in the ground too. Different circumstances. But I know about the version of going where you have been not going because the going seemed to require something you were not sure you had. And I know that when I finally went, the thing I had been trying to prepare, the thing I thought I needed to have ready, I did not use any of it. I just stood there. And that was enough." Walter was quiet for a long time. Outside, the street was still full. The engines had not restarted. The 200 people on the 200 motorcycles were waiting with the patience of people who have somewhere to be, but have decided that this is where they are. The afternoon light had moved in the way that November afternoon light moves, tilting lower, finding different angles through the barred window of the shop. It fell now across the velvet box on the counter, and across Ray Decker's hands on his knees, and across Walter Greer's face in the plastic chair. And what it found in each of these places was specific and particular. The way light is when it knows where it is going. Ray Decker stood from the stool. He went to the counter. He picked up the velvet box. He carried it to the corner of the shop and he held it out. He said, "These do not belong here. They belong with the man who earned them." Walter looked at the box. Ray Decker said, "I know you needed to come here today. I know you did not have another option, and you are not a man who comes somewhere like this unless there is not another option. But you have options now. And these are yours. They are a part of what you are and what you were, and they should stay with you." Walter's trembling hands came up from his lap. He took the box. He held it for a moment without looking at it. The way you hold something when the holding of it is already more than you can accommodate, and looking at it would be too much at once. Then he opened the lid. He looked at the 3 medals in their faded satin, the Bronze Star and the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Purple Heart with his name on the back of it. Arthur Pendleton. Not Arthur. Walter. Walter Greer, who had been 20 years old in Normandy in 1944, which was the same age as the girl behind the counter who had posted a photograph of 3 medals, because she could not think of anything else to do, and because some things are more important than a job that pays minimum wage to watch people's decisions become inventory. His shoulders began to move, and he did not make a sound, not at first. The shoulders moved and his head came down, and 2 things moved down his face, one from each eye following the deep lines of 99 years of weather and time and feeling, and he held the box in his trembling hands, and he let them fall. Nobody in the room moved toward him or away from him. Nobody offered words. The room held what it was holding, which was a very old man who had held himself together through a very long afternoon. For the same reason he had held himself together through everything, which was that he was Walter Greer and holding together was what he did. And now the holding had become unnecessary and he was letting it down. Nora stood behind the counter. She had pressed post before she could think about it too carefully. She had pressed it because some things are more important than careful thinking. And what you find out afterward is whether the part that was more important was right. She had found out. She looked at Mr. Ketridge. He was looking at the corner of the shop. His hand was resting on the counter near where the coffee cup was, and his face had finished its revisions and settled into something that was quiet and clear. He said to her quietly, without looking away from the corner, "You should have told me when he first came in." She thought about that. She said, "I did not know what I was going to do when he first came in. I only knew I could not do what I was supposed to do." He said, "What you were supposed to do is follow the process." She said, "Yes." He said, and the process in this case was wrong. She said, "Yes." He stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "I have been doing this for a long time. You learn to follow the process, because the process is what allows you to do it for a long time. You stop seeing the individual things." She said, "I know." He said, "That is not a small thing to stop seeing." She said, "No, it is not." He picked up the cold coffee cup and looked at it, and set it in the trash can below the counter. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the street full of motorcycles and the officer on the sidewalk, and the velvet box in the old man's hands in the corner. He said, "I am going to go out and speak to the officer, to let him know everything here is in order." Nora said yes. He said, "When I come back, we should talk about the documentation from Harlow and Associates. I have a friend who practices financial law. We should give him copies." She said, "I have the originals in the office." He said, "Good." He went to the door. He paused with his hand on it and looked back at the room one more time at Ray Decker and the men near the entrance and Walter Greer holding the velvet box in the plastic chair. And whatever he was looking at resolved itself in his face into something he did not put into words. And he pushed the door open and went outside. The bell chimed. Ray Decker came back to stand near the counter. He looked at Nora with the same direct, intelligent attention he had been looking at her with since he walked in. He said, "You did not know what was going to happen when you posted that." She said, "No." He said, "You did it anyway." She said, "I did not know what else to do. I knew I could not complete the transaction, and I knew I could not stop the transaction by myself. And I knew that doing nothing was not something I could do. So I did the only thing I could think of, which was to tell people what was happening." He said most people would not have told people. Most people would have told themselves it was not their problem, or that there was nothing they could do, or that getting involved was too complicated. She said, "It is not someone else's problem. Just because it happened in front of you instead of in front of them." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "How old are you?" She said, 20. He said, 20. He said it the way people say a number when the number is doing something unexpected, when the number is smaller than the thing it is attached to. Then one of the men near the door said his name and he turned, and there was a brief exchange that Nora could not fully hear, and Ray Decker nodded and looked back at her. He said, "There is something else we would like to do with Mr. Greer's permission. We would like to see his home, to understand what the situation is." She said, "I do not know his address." He said, "The post you made. You mentioned his name and the situation. There are people outside right now who have already found his address in the public records. We are not going to go without him, and without his permission. I want to be clear about that. Nothing happens without his consent." She looked at Walter in the corner. He had composed himself again. The box was closed in his lap, and his hands were resting on it, and his back was as it had been from the first moment he walked through the door, straight. She said, "I will ask him." She came out from behind the counter. She walked to the corner of the shop, and she crouched down as Ray Decker had done, putting herself at the old man's level. She said, "Mr. Greer, some of these men would like to accompany you home, to see if there is anything they can help with." He looked at her. His pale eyes had the look they had had when she read the word groceries to herself. For the first time, the look of someone who has arrived at the edge of what their pride will allow, and is standing at that edge. She said, "You have managed alone for a long time. I can see that. It is obvious in everything about you. But these men are offering and accepting an offer from someone who wants to help is not the same as asking. Accepting is its own kind of dignity." He was quiet. He looked at the box in his lap. He looked at the helmet full of money on the floor beside him. He looked at the room at Ray Decker near the counter, and the two men at the door and the street outside still full of motorcycles in the fading November light. He said, "My house has not been in good repair." She said, "That is all right." He said, "I have not had company in some time." She said, "That is all right too." He looked at her for a long moment with those winter sky eyes that had seen Normandy and a long marriage, and a son who died without reconciliation, and 14 months of letters from a man named Harlow that arrived with increasing frequency and decreasing hope. He said, "Then I suppose we should go." He put his hand on the arm of the chair, and he pushed himself up, and Nora rose with him, and she stepped back enough to give him his space, which he used to straighten himself to his full height one more time. He tucked the velvet box under his arm. He walked to where Ray Decker was standing, and he said, "I believe my car is around the corner on 5th. I do not drive it much anymore. The girl was going to take me." Ray Decker said, "We can do that." Walter looked at the window, at the street full of motorcycles waiting for him. He said, "I have never ridden on one of those." Ray Decker said, "There is a sidecar on the bike at the front. Warm enough for November if you have a good coat." Walter looked at his tweed coat. He looked at Ray Decker. Something moved in his face, the same something that had moved there when he first said the word Normandy. The compressed weight of a lifetime in a single expression. He said, "I have a good coat." Ray Decker said, "Then let us go." Nora came out from behind the counter one more time, and she got her jacket from the hook by the office door, and she put it on, and she looked at the shop, at the flickering light above the middle case, at the condensation ring on the glass counter, the circle she had been tracing when the bell chimed 45 minutes ago. Mr. Ketridge was outside on the sidewalk talking to the officer. She looked at the security camera in the upper corner, the small black dome that documented everything. She looked at the velvet box tucked under the arm of a 99-year-old man who was walking toward the front door of Henderson's Pawn on a Tuesday in November. She followed him out. The cold hit her, the November cold that had been waiting outside while everything inside was happening. The street was exactly what she had seen through the window, and being in it was different from seeing it through the window, in the way that being in anything is different from observing it from a distance. 200 motorcycles. The people on them and around them in leather and denim, and the particular baron of people who had chosen. When their phones showed them a photograph of 3 medals and a name to get on their bikes and come here instead of staying wherever they were. They were looking at Walter Greer, not staring, looking. The way you look at something that you have come specifically to see with attention and without apology. Walter Greer stood on the sidewalk of Elm Street in his tweed coat, with the velvet box under his arm. And he looked back at 200 people who had come because a 20-year-old girl behind a counter had not been able to do nothing. He was 99 years old. He had been 20 in Normandy. In between, he had worked and married and raised a son imperfectly and lost a wife and grown old, in rooms that had changed their character over the decades, until they were just rooms. And he had arrived at this Tuesday in November carrying 3 medals and enough pride to keep his back straight, and not enough money to eat. And this was where he had arrived. He looked at the motorcycles and the people on them, and after a long moment he gave a single nod. The nod of a man who is acknowledging something that is larger than he planned for, and is not going to pretend otherwise. Someone in the line of motorcycles began to clap. Then the person next to them. It moved down the line the way the helmet had moved person to person, until it reached the end and turned around and came back. And the sound of it filled Elm Street and went up into the November air. And the officer on the sidewalk stood with his hat in his hand again. And Mr. Ketridge stood beside him, and Nora stood at the door of the shop and watched Walter Greer stand in the middle of all of it. He did not wave. He did not perform anything. He simply stood there with his back straight and received what was being given him, which was not pity and not charity, but acknowledgment. The acknowledgment of 200 people who had come to say that what he had done and what he had been and what he had survived and endured had not gone unwitnessed, that the world had not stopped paying attention, simply because he was 99 years old, and alone in rooms that had changed their character. The clapping went on for a while. Then Ray Decker appeared beside Walter and said something close to his ear, and Walter nodded again, and they walked together toward the motorcycle at the front of the line. And someone helped Walter into the sidecar, settling him in with the careful efficiency of people who understand that care and competence are not opposites. And someone else appeared with a jacket, not a vest with patches, but a plain jacket, warm and practical, and put it around the old man's shoulders over the tweed coat. Nora watched the procession begin to form. She thought about what happened next, about what she had put in motion, about what 200 people on motorcycles intended to do when they got to the house on whatever street Walter Greer lived on, and saw whatever condition that house was in. She thought about Dennis Harlow in his office somewhere in this city, doing whatever he was doing on a Tuesday afternoon, unaware that the thing he had constructed around himself over years of careful language and institutional authority was already beginning to come apart. Not in the courtroom, not through the official channels first, but through a photograph on a community page and a reporter who had been waiting for 7 months for exactly the anchor that had just arrived in their inbox. She thought about the velvet box tucked under Walter Greer's arm as he settled into the sidecar. She thought about the word Normandy and what it contained, and how much of what it contained would never be accessible to anyone who had not been there. She went back inside and got the original letters from the office. She put them in an envelope. She wrote Mr. Ketridge's lawyer friend's name on the outside because Mr. Ketridge had mentioned the name and she had retained it the way she retained things that might be needed later. She put the envelope in her bag. She turned off the light in the office. She locked the front door of Henderson's Pawn behind her because Mr. Ketridge had asked her to, and because the shop was going to be closed for the rest of this Tuesday, which had turned out to be something other than ordinary. She walked to her car, which was around the corner on 5th, parked where Walter Greer's own car was parked. The old car he did not drive much anymore. She got in. She started the engine. She pulled out onto the street and joined the procession that was already moving 200 motorcycles and one small car with a broken heater and a girl who had pressed post before she could think about it too carefully, following a sidecar carrying an old man in a tweed coat and a borrowed jacket through the November streets of a city that was about to learn what it had let go on too long in the house on whatever street Walter Greer called home. The engines filled the air. The afternoon continued its work of becoming evening. The house was on Carpenter Street, 11 blocks from the pawn shop, in a neighborhood that had been built when the city was younger and more certain of itself, and had since settled into the particular condition of places that are not abandoned, but are not tended, that exist in the space between those two states, where the evidence of former care is still visible underneath the evidence of its long absence. Nora had followed the procession through 11 blocks of streets that were not built for 200 motorcycles moving together. And the city had accommodated this the way cities accommodate things that are happening regardless of the city's opinion about them, by stepping aside. People on sidewalks stopped. People in cars pulled over. A man walking a dog stood at a corner and watched the procession pass, and did not resume walking until it had gone entirely. She had been watching the sidecar through her windshield for 11 blocks. She could see the back of Walter's head, the white of his hair under the November sky, and the way he held himself even in the sidecar, even being carried through his own city by someone else with the upright bearing that appeared to be involuntary by now, written into his spine by decades of practice until it no longer required a decision. The procession turned onto Carpenter Street and slowed and stopped. Nora parked behind the last motorcycle and got out and looked at the house. It was a small bungalow, single-story, white paint that had been white for a long time, without being refreshed, so that what remained was something between white and the color of old paper. The porch ran the width of the front of the house, and one of its support posts had developed a lean that the roof above it had accommodated by developing a corresponding sag. The front steps were intact, but soft-looking, the wood of them having absorbed enough years of weather to lose its structural confidence. A section of the porch railing was missing entirely. The gutters along the roofline held evidence of several autumns of leaves. The front yard was not overgrown. It was maintained in the minimal way of someone who has managed to keep things from becoming worse while lacking the means to make them better. The grass was cut. There were no accumulations of debris, but the flower beds that had once defined the edges of the front walk were empty. The soil of them compacted and undisturbed the plants that had been in them, gone long enough that no trace of them remained. 2 men had already gotten out of the sidecar process and were helping Walter onto the front walk. He stood on the sidewalk in front of his house, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something he sees every day and therefore usually does not see. And then he looked at the 200 people who had followed him here, and he was quiet for a moment. He said, "It has gotten away from me." He said it to no one in particular. To the air, perhaps, or to the house itself. Ray Decker stood beside him and said nothing. One of the men near the back of the group had pulled out a phone and was photographing the house from several angles, systematically the way someone photographs something they are assessing, rather than something they find beautiful. Others were moving along the perimeter looking at the foundation, looking at the roofline, looking at the porch structure, with the attention of people who know what they are looking for. Nora stood at the edge of the front walk and watched this happen. She held her bag with the envelope inside it against her side. Walter looked at the front door. He had his key in his hand. He walked up the front path and up the soft steps, testing each one carefully. And he unlocked the door and pushed it open, and went inside, and Ray Decker followed him. And Nora followed Ray Decker. The interior of the house was clean. This was the first thing she noticed, and it mattered because cleanliness in this context was not incidental. It was the result of sustained effort by a man with limited physical resources who had decided that whatever else the years had taken, they were not going to take his standards. The surfaces were dusted. The floors were swept. The kitchen, visible from the front room, had dishes in the drying rack arranged with a neatness that was almost architectural, but the cleanliness could not change what the house contained, which was not much. The furniture was old in the way that furniture becomes old when it has been in the same place for 40 years and has not been replaced because replacement was not available, and also because the furniture was what had always been there, and the woman who had chosen it was gone. A sofa with cushions that had compressed over decades into a permanent record of the positions of the people who had sat in them. A television that was not large. A side table with a lamp. A recliner near the window that faced the front yard positioned to catch whatever light the afternoon offered. On the wall above the sofa, a photograph in a wooden frame. A woman young in the photograph with dark hair and a direct expression that had the quality of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and is comfortable with that knowledge. Beside her, a man who was unmistakably Walter Greer, younger by many decades, in a suit that had been the good suit, the one kept for occasions. Nora looked at the photograph and then looked away. On the side table beside the recliner, there was a stack of papers that she recognized. The letters from Harlow and Associates. The ones she had not taken from the house, but that were identical in format to the ones she had already put in the envelope in her bag. They were held together with a rubber band and placed at the edge of the table where they could be reached from the chair, which meant that Walter had been sitting in that chair, looking at those letters, sitting in the chair that faced the window, and the yard with those letters within reach. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to sit in a chair every day with letters within reach that told you that the thing you had worked your life to build was gone. The kitchen pantry was open. She could see from where she stood that the shelves held less than they should. Not nothing, but less. A careful inventory. The kind of stocking that represents someone tracking what is there against what is needed, and making the calculation come out on the side of enough, just barely enough every week. The refrigerator, when one of the men opened it to look, contained what it contained, which was also careful and also less than it should have been. Walter stood in the middle of his front room and watched these men move through the perimeter of his life, and he did not offer comment or explanation. He stood with his hands folded in front of him and the velvet box tucked under his arm, and he let them look. Ray Decker came to stand beside him. He said, "With your permission, we would like to come back on Saturday." Walter said, "Saturday." Ray Decker said, "We have people who know roofing, people who know carpentry, people who know plumbing and electrical work and painting. We would like to bring them here on Saturday morning with the materials they need and spend the day addressing what needs to be addressed." Walter looked at the front of his house through the window, at the porch with its leaning post and its sagging roofline and its missing section of railing. He said, "That is a great deal to ask of people who do not know me." Ray Decker said, "You told me in the shop that you were 20 years old in Normandy. I was 22 in the Gulf. And the men who did what you did in the years before I was born are why the things I did in my years were possible. That is not a debt that expires. That is not something that gets balanced because a lot of time has passed. We know you. We know what you did. That is enough." Walter was quiet. The room was quiet. Outside, the sound of 200 engines was absent because 200 engines had been turned off, and the street was therefore quieter than it had probably been in a long time. And in that quiet, Nora could hear the house itself, the particular sounds of an old house that has been inhabited continuously, and that contains in its settled joints and its accommodated foundations the record of all that time. Walter said, "All right. Saturday." Ray Decker said, "We will be here at 7 in the morning. You do not need to do anything except be here and tell us if we are getting something wrong." Walter said, "I am always here." He said it without self-pity, as a simple statement of fact about the nature of his current life. He was always here because here was where he was, and the statement contained no complaint about that, only the accuracy of long habit. Before they left, one of the men brought in groceries. Not a symbolic amount. A genuine amount, the kind that fills a pantry and a refrigerator, and means that the calculation of what is there against what is needed does not have to be made again for several weeks. The men who brought them in stocked the shelves with the same efficiency they had applied to everything else this afternoon, moving through the kitchen with purpose and without fuss. And when they were done, the kitchen looked like the kitchen of a house where someone is being taken care of. Walter stood in the kitchen doorway and watched this happen. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Nora put the envelope from her bag on the kitchen counter. She said, "These are copies of the Harlow letters. Mr. Ketridge has a contact in financial law. He is going to make sure they reach the right people." Walter looked at the envelope. He said, "I signed things I did not fully understand. A man in a good suit told me the language was standard, and I believed him because he was in a good suit." She said, "That is what he counted on. That is how it works. And it is not going to keep working, not for him. Not after today." She did not know this with the certainty she was expressing it. She knew it with the certainty of someone who has set something in motion and cannot see the end of it, but can see the direction. The direction was the right one. Walter looked at her for a moment with those pale winter eyes. He said, "You are 20 years old." She said, "Yes." He said, "My wife would have liked you very much. She had no patience for looking away from things that required looking at. She would have recognized that in you immediately." Nora stood with that for a moment. It was the kind of thing that could not be responded to adequately, so she did not try. She simply held it and nodded and looked at the photograph on the wall in the front room. The woman with the dark hair and the direct expression. She understood now what Walter had said in the pawn shop earlier. The kind you do not describe well because the description never gets close enough to the actual thing. They left him with his stocked kitchen and his velvet box and the afternoon light coming through the window of the front room across the recliner, and the side table where the Harlow letters no longer sat because Nora had put them in an envelope. He stood in the doorway to watch them go, and he held the door frame with one hand, not for support, but in the way of someone who is standing at the threshold of something and wants to feel the boundary of it. Saturday came with a cold, clear sky and 7 in the morning and the sound of trucks, not motorcycles this time. Trucks the kind with toolboxes bolted into the bed and lumber racked along the sides and the particular weight of loaded vehicles that changes the sound they make on residential streets. They came down Carpenter Street as the first real light of the morning was establishing itself in the east, and they parked in the way of people who have done this before, efficiently leaving the street passable, taking up only what they needed. The men who got out of the trucks were the same men who had been on the motorcycles on Tuesday, or most of them supplemented by others who had heard the story in the days since and had wanted to be part of what was happening on Saturday. They came with tool belts and work gloves and the kind of cold morning energy of people who have a specific thing to do and are looking forward to doing it. Walter was already on the porch when they arrived. He had been up since before 5, which was when he was always up, and he had made coffee. And when Ray Decker came up the front walk at 7:05, Walter was holding 2 cups and offered one. Ray Decker took it. They stood on the porch together and watched the trucks unload. Lumber, roofing materials, paint, several gallons of it a white that was several degrees warmer than the exhausted white of the current exterior. Bags of concrete mix. A new section of porch railing pre-cut to the dimensions that someone had measured on Tuesday before they left. Window glazing compound for the window on the north side of the house that had been cracked for so long. Walter had stopped registering it as a crack and had started registering it as a feature of the window. The work began without ceremony. There was no organization meeting, no delegation of tasks, because the tasks had been delegated earlier in the week and everyone knew what they were doing and where they were going. Men went to the roof with safety equipment and the roofing materials. Men went to the porch with the lumber and the missing railing section. Men went inside to look at the furnace, which was original to the house and which had been serviced minimally, and the electrical box which had not been opened in years. Walter stood on the porch with his cup and watched. After a while, he said to Ray Decker, "I feel I should be doing something." Ray Decker said, "You are doing something. You are letting us do this." For some people, that is the harder part. Walter considered this. He said, "I have not been good at letting people do things for me." Ray Decker said, "Most people who are good at doing things for themselves are not good at letting people do things for them. The skills are not complementary." Walter said my wife was good at both, doing and letting. She could do anything herself, and she could also receive help without making the person who was helping feel like they were intruding. I never fully understood how she did that. Ray Decker said, "Some people are built differently than others." Walter said she was. He sat in the chair that was brought out to the porch for him, a chair from inside the house that was steadier than anything currently available on the porch itself. And he watched the work proceed from this position with the attention of a man who has managed things and understands the management of things and can see that what is happening is being done correctly. Nora arrived at 9 in the morning. She had stopped at the place on the corner for coffee and brought enough for the people working nearby, which was more coffee than she had expected to need, but less than was wanted because the people working nearby numbered more than she had anticipated. She walked the perimeter of the house with a cup in each hand, distributing, and what she saw as she walked was competence. Genuine, specific, expert competence. The man on the roof was not a man who had decided that roofing was something he could probably figure out. He was a man who knew roofing, who had known it for years, whose hands moved across the material with the sureness of deep familiarity. The men at the porch were the same way. The man inside with the electrical box was the same way. She had thought when she pressed post on Tuesday that she was asking for help. In a general sense, the kind of help that a community offers when it is moved by something and wants to express that it has been moved. What she had gotten was specific, skilled, organized help, the kind that comes from a community that has learned over decades to take care of its own and has expanded its definition of its own to include a 99-year-old man in a tweed coat who had been 20 years old at Normandy. Mr. Ketridge arrived in the afternoon. He came in his car, not his work truck, the car he drove when he was going somewhere as himself, rather than as the owner of a business. He parked on the street and got out and stood for a moment looking at the house, which by mid-afternoon looked substantially different from the house that had been there in the morning. The porch was repaired. The lean in the post was gone, corrected at its base, where the wood had rotted and been replaced. The railing ran complete around the perimeter. The steps had been reinforced. The roof above the porch was no longer sagging because the thing that had been causing the sag had been addressed with new lumber and new fasteners, and the particular knowledge of what sagging roofs need. The exterior of the house was in the process of being painted. The new white was going on over the old white in long strokes, and where it had been applied, the house looked like a house that had been recently decided on, recently committed to, rather than a house that had been left to become whatever time made it. Mr. Ketridge walked up the front path and up the repaired steps, and Nora met him at the top. He looked at the work. He looked at the men doing it. He looked at Walter Greer in the chair on the repaired porch watching. He said to Nora, "I spoke to my lawyer contact yesterday evening. He has looked at the Harlow letters. He says there are actionable issues. He is making calls to the regulatory office on Monday." She said, "Good." He said these things take time. I want you to understand that. There is not a fast version of what happens to Dennis Harlow. She said, "I understand." He said, "But there is a version where what he did becomes public before the official proceedings are complete." My friend also spoke to someone at the paper. Apparently, the paper already had a file. She said Ray Decker mentioned he knew someone at the paper. Mr. Ketridge looked at Ray Decker, who was on the far side of the porch, talking to the man who had finished the railing work, and was examining it with the satisfied attention of someone confirming that what they made is what they intended to make. Mr. Ketridge said, "He seems to know a number of people." She said, "Yes." Mr. Ketridge looked at the house, at the new white going on over the old, at the roof above it that no longer sagged. He said, "Can I help with something?" He said it to the general vicinity, not specifically to Nora, and not specifically to Ray Decker. and Ray Decker heard it from across the porch and turned and looked at him, and after a brief assessment reached behind him to the tool bag near the railing and produced a paintbrush and extended it. Mr. Ketridge took off his jacket. He hung it over the repaired porch railing. He took the brush. He spent the next 2 hours painting the section of exterior wall accessible from the porch, working with the moderate competence of someone who has painted before, but does not do it professionally. And when he was finished, that section looked like the sections done by the professional painters, in the sense that it was white and even, and the fact that it was slightly less perfectly feathered at the edges was not visible from any distance that anyone would observe the house from. Walter watched him paint. He did not comment. He simply watched, and after a while he said to Ray Decker, "The man from the shop came." Ray Decker said yes. Walter said he did not have to. Ray Decker said no, he did not. Walter said people generally do not do things they do not have to. When they do them anyway, it means something. Ray Decker said it usually means that what they thought they had decided turns out not to have been what they actually believed. Walter looked at Mr. Ketridge with the paintbrush. He said, "I suppose that is right." The day ended in the late afternoon with the quality of ending that comes when a thing has been done and the doing of it has been complete. The trucks were loaded. The tools were packed. The roofing material scraps and the lumber offcuts and the paint trays were collected and disposed of. The porch was swept. The house on Carpenter Street looked like a house where someone lived who was being taken care of. Walter stood at the top of his repaired steps and looked at the street as the trucks prepared to leave. And there was something in his posture that was different from the posture he had had on Tuesday in the pawn shop, or even earlier this morning when he stood with his cup of coffee, watching the trucks unload. It was not less upright. It was upright in a different way. The uprightness of Tuesday had been the held uprightness of a man maintaining something under pressure. The uprightness of this Saturday evening was the natural uprightness of a man who has set the pressure down. Ray Decker came to stand beside him. He reached into the inside of his vest and produced something folded. He unfolded it and held it out. It was a vest. Not his own. Not a club vest with patches and rank and the documentation of affiliation. A plain leather vest, dark brown, well-made, new. Across the left breast, in letters that had been stitched with care, a name. Walter Greer. No other text. No patch. No designation. Just his name in the place where a man's name goes when the vest belongs to him. Walter looked at it. Ray Decker said, "This is not a membership. It is not an initiation or an obligation. It is an acknowledgment. We see you. We know who you are. And we would like you to know that you are not invisible to us and you are not alone." Walter reached out and took the vest. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The specific weight of new leather, which is different from the weight of old leather and will change over time into something particular to the person who wears it. He put it on, over the tweed coat. The leather over the tweed, the new thing over the old thing, and both of them were exactly right for what they were. Someone on the street said something Nora could not hear, and someone else laughed an easy, warm sound that belonged to the end of a long day of work done well. And Walter Greer stood at the top of his repaired steps, in his tweed coat and his new vest, with his name on it. And he looked at the street, and he allowed himself something that was close to a smile. Not the performed version of a smile, but the involuntary kind that arrives when a moment is more than what you had prepared to receive. Nora stood at the edge of the front walk, and she took a photograph with her phone. Not for the community page, not for anyone else. For herself, because there are things you want to have evidence of, things you want to be able to return to and confirm that they happened. The photograph showed an old man in a tweed coat and a leather vest, standing at the top of repaired steps, in front of a freshly painted house in the November afternoon light. And the expression on his face was not a smile exactly, but was in the territory of one. And behind him the house looked like a house that had been decided on. She kept the photograph. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, the article ran in the local paper. It ran with the photograph Nora had taken of the 3 medals on the desk lamp in the office of Henderson's Pawn. And it ran with the name Dennis Harlow and the specific details of what Harlow and Associates had done to the retirement accounts of several clients, of whom Walter Greer was the most recent, but not the only one. The article had been written by a reporter who had been building the file for 7 months, and who now had the anchor the file needed. And it was the kind of article that moves quickly from the local paper to other places because it contains a specific name and a specific amount of harm, and a specific victim whose photograph has already been shared widely enough that people recognize him. The State Financial Regulatory Office opened a formal investigation. This was not fast. It was, as Mr. Ketridge's contact had said, it would be a process, and processes have their own time. But the process was moving. Dennis Harlow's other clients began to come forward. In those 3 weeks, Walter Greer came to the chapter's Saturday gathering twice. He came in Ray Decker's truck because Ray Decker had taken to stopping by Carpenter Street on Saturday mornings without announcement, which Walter had initially objected to, and had then stopped objecting to, because the objection was not sincere. It was reflexive, and he was learning to tell the difference. He sat at the gatherings in his tweed coat and his vest, with his name on it, and he was introduced as Walter, without elaboration, because the people there either already knew who he was, or were told once, and did not need to be told again. He told stories. Not because he was asked to, and not because he wanted to perform his history for an audience. He told them the way old people tell stories when they find themselves in the company of people who are genuinely interested, which is to say, carefully and with detail, the details that confirm that the stories are true, because they are the kind of details that cannot be invented. He told them about the mud in Normandy, about the particular quality of the light on the morning of the 6th of June in 1944, and how it was ordinary light. Just morning light, not the light of something significant, and how the ordinariness of it was the strangest part. He told them about the cold. He told them about the men he had been with, their specific names and specific faces. The faces of young men who are young in the way that men are only young before they have been through something, and then are never quite that young again. He told them about coming home, about the way home was not what he had thought about during the time he was away, because the home he had thought about was the home as it had been before. And by the time he got back, both he and the home had changed enough that neither recognized the other immediately. He told them about meeting his wife Eleanor at a dance in 1946, 1 year after coming home, when he was still in the process of learning to be a person who was not in the war, and how she had looked at him across the room with the direct expression that was her natural expression, The expression that said, "I see you, and I have assessed you, and I have something to say about what I see," and how he had walked across that room toward her, because the directness of the look was the most honest thing he had encountered since coming home, and he needed honest things. The men listened to all of this. They listened the way men listen when they are not pretending to listen, with their full attention, and without the fidgeting that signals attention has gone elsewhere. One Sunday morning in the 4th week, Nora's phone rang. It was Ray Decker. He said, "I need you to know I am going to Walter's house this morning. I found Robert's grave, Elmwood Cemetery in Franklin, Tennessee, plot 7, row 14. I found it this week through the Veterans Affairs Burial Registry. I would like to take him there today if he will go. I thought you should know." She said, "Does he know you are coming?" Ray Decker said no. I did not want to give him time to talk himself out of it. She said, "That is probably right." Ray Decker said, "It is 9 hours each way. We will be back tomorrow. I have a clean truck and a good heater, and nowhere to be for 2 days." She said he will want to wear his good shoes. Ray Decker said, "I know." She said, "Tell him I know he will find the right thing to say when he gets there. Tell him that from me." Ray Decker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will tell him." He drove to Carpenter Street and knocked on the door at 7 in the morning. Walter answered in his robe, which was the first time Ray Decker had seen him in anything other than the tweed coat, and the robe was plaid and had been washed many times and was entirely appropriate for a Sunday morning. Ray Decker said, "Elmwood Cemetery, Franklin, Tennessee, plot 7, row 14. Robert Greer. I found it this week. It is 9 hours from here. I have nowhere to be." Walter stood in the doorway of his house. He looked at his hands, the fine trembling in them, the hands that had been in Normandy and had built things and held Eleanor and had not been placed on the shoulder of a boy named Robert often enough or at the right times. He said, "Give me 5 minutes to put on my good shoes." He put on his good shoes. He put on his good trousers and a clean shirt and the tweed coat and the vest with his name on it. He stood in front of the small mirror in the hallway of his house, and he looked at himself for a moment, this 99-year-old man in a tweed coat and a leather vest. And then he put on his hat, which was a hat he had had for many years, and which was the right hat for this occasion, and he went out to the truck. The drive took 9 hours and 20 minutes. They did not talk continuously. They talked in the intervals that felt natural, and were silent in the intervals that also felt natural. And the silences were the kind that exist between people who have established enough mutual understanding that silence does not need to be managed. Ray Decker had been to graves before. He had told Walter in the pawn shop that he knew about the version of going where you have been not going. And he had meant it. And he knew how to be present for this kind of going without making it about himself. Walter looked out the window at the country changing as they went south and east. The flat valley giving way to hills. The hills giving way to the first suggestions of mountains. The Tennessee hills coming up in the long afternoon light. He said at some point in the 4th or 5th hour, I was not kind to him about the things that mattered most. I was not unkind about the practical things. I made sure he had what he needed in material terms. But the things that a boy needs from his father that are not material things, I was not sufficient in those things. I knew what I knew how to do, and I did it, and I believed that was enough, and it was not enough. Ray Decker said, Most men of that generation were given the same equipment, the equipment for providing and not much else. Walter said that is true. It does not change what it cost him. Ray Decker said no, it does not. Walter said he was a good man. I know he was a good man because I heard about him secondhand through people who knew him in Tennessee. He had a business there, a small one, hardware, and he was known for being fair, and known for being reliable, and known for being someone that people came to when they had a problem that needed solving. Those are not small things to be known for. Ray Decker said no, they are not. Walter said I gave him that. I do not know if I gave it to him deliberately, but I gave it to him somehow. The reliability, the fairness. He learned those from somewhere, and the somewhere was probably me, even if I was not aware of teaching them. Ray Decker said, that is something. Walter said it is. I have been thinking about what it is for 20 years. It took me a long time to decide that it was something rather than nothing. There were many years when I decided it was nothing, that I had failed entirely. And those years were not useful years. The years when I decided it was something were more useful. They reached Franklin as the light was going. The cemetery was closed to vehicles at dusk. But Ray Decker had called ahead and spoken to the cemetery administrator, who had made an accommodation, as cemetery administrators will sometimes do when the request is a 99-year-old man who has not been before and may not be able to come again. And they drove in through the gate and along the narrow road that wound through the grounds to the section the administrator had described. They parked. Ray Decker said, I will wait here. Walter got out of the truck. He moved across the grass of the cemetery in the evening light, with his good shoes and his hat and his vest, moving carefully, but without hesitation. The way he had moved through everything in the time she had known him, with the specific gravity of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it. He found the marker. He stood in front of it. What happened in the next 12 minutes was private, in the way that certain things are private, not because they are hidden from view, but because they belong to the interior life of a person, and the interior life is not available for narration. Ray Decker sat in the truck. The cemetery was quiet. The evening light continued its process of becoming dark. When Walter came back to the truck, his hat was in his hand. He got in. He sat for a moment looking through the windshield at the cemetery. He said I told him I was sorry. I said the specific things I was sorry for. I thought I would not know what to say. And it turned out I had known what to say for 20 years. I had simply not had anywhere to say it. Ray Decker said nothing. Walter said I told him about his mother, about the things she would have said if she had been able to know him as an adult. She would have been proud of the business, the hardware business. She would have approved of the reputation he had built for fairness. She would have told him so directly which was her way. He put his hat back on. He said, I told him about the vest. Ray Decker said, what did you tell him about it? Walter said I told him that I had found people late, that it was possible to find people late, that I wished I had found them sooner, or rather that I wished I had been the kind of person sooner who made it possible for people to find him. But that late was not the same as not at all. The truck was warm. The heater worked, which Walter had noted with approval at the beginning of the drive, and now noted again simply by the fact of being warm in it. They drove back the next morning. Walter slept for 3 hours of the drive. The good sleep of a man who has put something down that he had been carrying for a long time. and Ray Decker drove in the early morning light through Tennessee and into the valley and did not wake him. Walter went to Franklin 3 times in the next 6 years. Each time Ray Decker drove. He never described what happened at the grave on the subsequent visits. He would return to the truck when he was ready and get in and sit for a moment and then say something each time. Something different. Each time the thing that the particular visit had produced, and Ray Decker would listen and then drive, and that was the whole of what the visits required. In the winters, he came to the chapter gatherings, and in the summers, he sat on the repaired porch on Carpenter Street in the mornings with his coffee, and people stopped by, which was something that had not happened before the Tuesday in November, or rather had happened less and less until it had stopped. And now happened again. Nora stopped by when she could. She had enrolled in the criminal justice program at the City College in January, which was the beginning of the year after the Tuesday in November. And her schedule was different from what it had been. But she found time on Sunday mornings when the rest of the week had not consumed it. She would bring coffee and sit on the porch with him, and they would talk about what she was studying, which interested him, because it involved the examination of systems. And he had spent 99 years forming opinions about systems and their failures. And they would talk about Eleanor, who he described with more detail and more ease as time went on, as if the describing of her was something that became more possible the more it was done. And they would talk about Robert sometimes, not always, but sometimes. She kept the photograph on her phone, the one from the Saturday afternoon of the repair, the old man in the tweed coat and the new vest at the top of the repaired steps. She looked at it occasionally, not with frequency, but with intention, when she needed to remember what a small decision made before you can think too carefully about it can produce. Dennis Harlow's case moved through its official stages. It was not fast, as Mr. Ketridge's contact had said it would not be. But it moved. The regulatory investigation became a civil case. The civil case produced an outcome that did not return to Walter what had been taken because the money was gone. In the specific way that money removed through the mechanisms of financial mismanagement is gone, dispersed, and transformed, and impossible to fully recover. But the outcome produced consequences for Harlow that were real and documented and public, which was its own form of accountability, the form that involves having your name attached permanently to what you did. The story of Walter Greer and the Tuesday in November and the 200 motorcycles did not remain local. It traveled the way stories travel when they contain things that people recognize as true. Not factually true only, but true in the deeper sense of corresponding to something people carry in them about how the world ought to work, and mostly does not, and occasionally does. It was told and retold in the specific way of stories that accumulate meaning with each retelling, rather than losing it. Walter Greer lived to be 105 years old. He died on a morning in March in his bed, in the house on Carpenter Street, in the room where he and Eleanor had slept for 41 years, and where he had slept alone for 37 years after that. He died in his sleep, which is the death that represents the body completing its work quietly and without drama. And there was in this a fittingness that the people who had known him recognized as consistent with him, because he had done everything with a minimum of drama and a maximum of intention. His house was warm when they found him. The furnace that had been serviced on the repair Saturday 6 years earlier had been maintained since then, serviced annually by the man from the chapter who knew furnaces, and it had continued to work because maintain things generally continue to work. The pantry was full. The funeral was on a Thursday. The weather was cold but clear. The kind of March day that cannot decide between winter and what comes after winter, and settles on elements of both. The funeral home had a capacity and the attendance exceeded it, which required arrangements to be made for people to stand in the parking area outside, which they did without complaint, because the weather was cold but clear and they had chosen to be there. His army friends were gone. He had outlived them all, which was the specific loneliness of very long lives, the loneliness of having been present at the beginning of things, whose other participants were no longer present. But the people who had come into his life in the years since the Tuesday in November were there, and they were many. The officer who had come to the pawn shop and stood with his hat in his hand was there. He stood with his hat in his hand again. Mr. Ketridge was there with his lawyer contact, who had worked on the Harlow case, and the reporter from the paper who had written the article, and several people from the neighborhood on Carpenter Street who had stopped being invisible to Walter and had stopped finding Walter invisible after the Saturday repair, and the bikers were there. Not 200 this time. More. Because the story had traveled, and because people who had not been at the pawn shop or the repair or the Saturday gatherings had followed the story and understood what it meant and wanted to be present for the ending of it, which was not an ending but a completion. The completion of a life that had been lived with intention and honesty, and had in its final years found the thing that the earlier years had been insufficient, in which was the knowledge of being seen. Ray Decker sat in the front row. The service was simple. A pastor who had met Walter twice said the things that pastors say, the true things about lives and time and what remains. Some people spoke. Ray Decker spoke briefly with the economy of a man who knows that the weight of what he is saying does not require many words to carry it. And then at the end, the engines started. Not all at once. One at a time from the back, the sound building forward through the parking area and the street, and the rows and rows of motorcycles parked along the block. Each engine finding the note and holding it the sound, layering and building until the air itself was made of it, until the quiet March morning was replaced by something that was not quiet, but that was not noise either. That was something that existed in its own category, the category of sound that is also tribute, also statement, also the thing that gets said when words have been used and found insufficient. Walter Greer's 3 medals were on the casket: the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Purple Heart, and the Bronze Star in the velvet box, the lid open, so that they were visible, the Silver Cross, and the purple ribbon, and the specific gravity of things earned at a cost that cannot be calculated. Beside them, the leather vest, plain dark brown. The leather of it now 6 years old, and holding in its surface the record of the Saturdays and the porch mornings and the rides in Ray Decker's truck, and the way that new leather changes over time into something particular to the person who wears it. The name on the breast pocket, Walter Greer, in letters stitched with care. Just the name, which was all that was needed. Nora stood near the back. She was 26 years old. She was in her 2nd year of graduate study in criminal justice, which was 2 years beyond where she had been when she started, which was 2 years beyond where she had been on the Tuesday in November when she was 20, and pressed post before she could think about it too carefully. She had the photograph on her phone. She had looked at it that morning before she came the photograph from the Saturday afternoon 6 years ago. The old man in the tweed coat and the new vest at the top of the repaired steps, with the thing on his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the territory of one. She had looked at it for a while, and then she had come here. She stood near the back and she listened to the engines and she thought about a condensation ring on a glass countertop on a Tuesday afternoon, a perfect circle that she had been tracing when the bell above the door chimed. She thought about the word groceries and what it had landed like and what she had done about it. She thought about the things you cannot plan, the things that present themselves in the ordinary course of an ordinary day and ask you without asking to decide what kind of person you are in that moment. The things that do not wait for you to be ready. She thought about a 99-year-old man standing in front of his son's grave in the March evening in Tennessee, saying the things he had known what to say for 20 years and had finally found the place to say them. She thought about the vest on the casket. She thought about what it means to arrive late to something and find that late is not the same as not at all. The engines held their note in the cold, clear March morning, and the sound of them went up into the air above the city, and it did not diminish quickly. It stayed the way certain sounds stay the way things stay, that are said with the full weight of what they mean, with nothing held back and nothing performed and nothing required in return. Nora stood near the back and she listened. She did not need to be at the front. She had been there at the beginning on the Tuesday that started it in the pawn shop with the alarm button under her hand and the velvet box on the counter and the old man in the plastic chair, and she had been at the beginning was enough. The rest of it had been its own thing, larger than her, and not belonging to her, belonging to Walter Greer and the people who had come to be around him in the years when he allowed it. Her part had been small. She had looked at something that required looking at, and she had not looked away. And she had pressed post before she could think about it too carefully. That was the whole of what she had done. It was, she understood now, standing in the cold March morning, listening to 200 engines hold their note for a man they had known for 6 years and would not forget enough.